This video is sponsored by Keeps. More on them later. If you travel back through the various ages and cycles with which video games are designed and released to the public, you can see some very well-defined trends. In the 80s we had space shooters, both vertical and horizontal. In the 90s we had platformers, many of them taking advantage of an extra dimension for true 3D platforming. In the 2000s we had about 1,000 shooter games released every year, and the 2010s was where open world games made their home. You can chart these trends as technology improves and more games are able to do things that only a select few were capable of doing before, but as soon as something becomes a trend, you're inundated with good and bad examples of that trend. We're seeing that now with Battle Royale games, the natural follow-on from open world environments, replacing the exploration aspects with competitive survival against dozens of other players. Whether or not Battle Royale has taken the focus away from open world design is a debate for possibly later in this video, but for now I just want to pull things back a bit and look at some open world video games that I've enjoyed in the past. Who knows, if I can remember how to write an outro, maybe we'll see what we can learn from a couple of decades of open world games of varying quality. Maybe they'll hold the secrets of the universe, I don't know.
Open world games have been so successful since they hit the mainstream that it's very likely that they will carry this forward for many decades to come. And I would like to see those decades with some kind of full head of hair. And since I'm 26 and a man, I'm part of the 2 out of 3 guys who will have some kind of male pattern baldness before they turn 35. But luckily, this video is sponsored by Keeps, who work wonders with their FDA approved treatment for hair loss. You know, if open world games promote some kind of realism, when's the protagonist going to start losing their hair, huh?
I'll leave that to the expert game designers who know what they're doing, but if I want to have some hair left on my head, then it's a good idea to listen to the experts at today's sponsors, Keeps. These guys are very talented when it comes to avoiding hair loss with their FDA-approved treatment that comes with years of experience and a buttload of successful cases under their belts. In fact, they're so smart that they know that hair loss is different from one guy to the next, which is why their treatment packages comes in 3 different variants depending on what kind of hair loss you're experiencing. Plus, you can get everything shipped directly to your door so you don't have to wait around for the world to not be so terrible before you can fix your hair. Keeps' treatment packages are already cheaper than their competitors, but with the deal they're running with me here today, you can save even more money. For a limited time offer, you can go to keeps.com/rabbid or click the link in the description to receive 50% off your first order. Stop hair loss now before it's too late.
Alrighty then, let's open up about open worlds.
Charting the rise of open world games will take you to various well-known intellectual properties, including some like the original Legend of Zelda, which in 1986 was several decades ahead of its time. But I think the best place to start is where the general public hopped on board. Hard to nail down one game that resonated with everyone, but I think the best place to start is with the most recent trilogy of Elder Scrolls games, starting with Morrowind in 2002 and taking us all the way up to Skyrim in 2011. The reason why I'm not including the likes of Daggerfall or Arena, I guess, is because Morrowind marked a significant shift of focus towards open-ended, free-form storytelling. Less so that you have to go here and do this quest, and more like, hey, you paid good money to play this game, who am I to tell you what to do? This is especially valuable in plot-centric RPGs with customizable characters, since it gives the player far greater control over who their character is and where they would want to explore first. Along with Bethesda's work with Fallout, these games were a lot of people's first experience of open world games and having this much freedom to do what you want. And it was Skyrim releasing in 2011 and Bethesda's strong marketing that helped to push this onto mainstream audiences at the start of a decade that went kind of crazy with open world games. Although, worth mentioning that the Fallout game with the least amount of Bethesda influencing things post-rights acquisition, New Vegas, is one of the best open world games you'll ever play, and one that really shows off the strength of freeform storytelling. It's like a choose-your-own-adventure game but with guns and Julius Caesar cosplayers. Skyrim, perhaps more than previous Elder Scrolls games, really pushed on with the openness of its world, with Todd Howard's famous proclamation that you can climb any mountain you see. Yes, Todd, I want that in games. I don't want this in games. Don't do this. Bad, Todd. It's an important evolution of how video games handle exploration, moving away from scripted scenarios and being led through an almost guided safari of a game's main events, and now you can have so much control over what happens and when it happens. Skyrim sold so well and has been ported onto every machine that can run it to such an extent that it's highly likely that most people watching this video will have some experience of Skyrim, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if it was one of their first experiences of playing an open world video game. Of course, Skyrim was hardly the first open world game that blew up in a big way, since as soon as Grand Theft Auto traded out the top-down perspective for a freely explorable, three-dimensional city explorer through the lens of a carjacking psychopath, this franchise became a hell of a lot more popular. I distinctly remember playing GTA 3 at a friend's house when neither of us were even remotely close to being old enough, and I was kinda stunned just how much freedom you had to explore this city and blow most of it up. Arguably Shenmue beat GTA to the punch with its explorable city, but the way in which GTA lets you destroy everything in sight almost puts it in the sandbox genre, almost the next step away from organized structure and towards something a lot more open and unconfined. I guess it strikes at the heart of what people enjoy about Grand Theft Auto games, and something you can see carried forward through sequels all the way to GTA 5 and GTA Online. People generally don't care about these stories. Characters, yes, although it wasn't that long ago that the protagonist was silent, but you can see how much people enjoy GTA Online when the gameplay component of GTA 5 is front and center. The modding scene is also a little bit crazy, because the open world backdrop of GTA 5 is so good that it facilitates fans to be this creative and introduce so many unique ideas. Los Santos is so well imagined that it feels like walking around a real city, and with some added video gameness and a bucket load of freedom, that's a pretty powerful combination. So much so that in 2005 Rockstar saw what Grand Theft Auto was capable of and decided to work on some kind of Wild West GTA set in the American frontier and wring every last bit of processing power out of the PS3 and Xbox 360. Red Dead Redemption is an incredible feat for how well it replicates a Western setting, in a similar way to GTA's approach with realistically doing the same with a city environment. But Red Dead Redemption's biggest and most impressive feather in its cap is how it imagines the wildlife outside of the towns. Yeah, there's shooting to be done and you can play a lot of poker and get pissed off your tits, but my big takeaway from Red Dead Redemption was how it turns miles of dusty landscape into an authentic replication of a living, breathing habitat for dozens of wild animals. It's a completely different set of skills, but an achievement that is on par with creating a bustling city full of NPCs going through their daily routine. Lucky for me then that Red Dead Redemption 2 doubled down on this realistic approach to the wilderness, because that game is easily one of the prettiest I've ever played, and when you can drape these gorgeous graphics onto a near anal retentive attention to detail with animals reacting pretty convincingly, it goes a huge way towards helping you lose yourself in this world. Open worlds, when done really well, kind of center themselves around immersion. You don't even need a lot of quests to do it if you've got a world that is fun to explore and mess around in, because that amount of care given to realistically creating a world that you'd want to mess around in outside of a video game, complete with horse testicles that grow and shrink depending on how cold it is, that's kind of insane. The fact that RDR2 also has one of the best stories ever put into a video game almost feels unnecessary. Like, you could get so much mileage out of roaming around these forests and galloping through the deserts on horseback, that a well-structured narrative on top of this is like a perfectly curated 3-course meal on top of a gourmet buffet. I've never liked having this much space to play in before now. But space can be your enemy, or at least a special kind of obstacle that helps to reframe your game's central concepts. I did wonder if I should spend a little bit of time in this video talking about bad open world games and what we can learn from those, but generally, those games fail with open worlds because they're trying to inject openness into a type of game that doesn't really warrant this change. So like, Dynasty Warriors went open world of its 9th game, but didn't change anything about how Dynasty Warriors plays, everything's just further apart. Or another issue is that they're just not filling the space of anything and leaving the player to explore locations that have nothing in them. This was a major criticism of No Man's Sky when it first came out, that despite being absolutely gigantic in scope and having its procedural generation working overtime to create things that were worth finding in the mind-boggling infinity of space, it was just a lot of open space with very little in it. Things are better years later, but perhaps still a little too empty for some. In Shadow of the Colossus, emptiness is the entire point of the game. I've rarely played a game where a lack of exposition about the world you're exploring or key details from the story is so beneficial, because it allows you to piece everything together by yourself, often with very little success. As Wanda, you're tasked with killing more than a dozen giant monsters in order to bring this girl back to life. Her relation to Wanda left entirely up to your imagination. Sister? Love interest? Not a fucking clue. So yeah, whatever, you take off into the world to find some answers, or at least some other sign of humanity, and there's nothing. Apart from you, your horse aggroes some colossi, and 77 pesky lizards, you're basically on your own in a massive open world setting. Yeah, sure, there's locations within that world that are hiding these colossi, but beyond that, virtually nothing more to find. The emptiness is almost agoraphobic in nature, paradoxically suffocating with a sense that there's nothing to see, and more crucially, no allies that can help you in a pinch. You really are on your own with this one. You have your central hub that you're teleported back to after slaying each colossus, but no other tangible landmarks. Nothing that indicates there's a village of people nearby, or even a friendly merchant to sell you useful items. No friendly faces, just grass and dirt. In Subnautica, grass and dirt are traded out for water. Lots of it. If Shadow of the Colossus weaponizes agoraphobia, Subnautica is a case study in the potency of thalassophobia, the fear of deep water. There's both similarities and clear distinctions with these two games. Shadow of the Colossus uses its space to make the player feel truly alone, whereas Subnautica goes for the complete opposite feeling. Fearing deep water isn't so much about fearing the water itself or the possibility of drowning. It always comes back to not being able to touch or even see the bottom and fearing what could be swimming around you. The alien world of Subnautica is similarly unknown and devoid of friendly faces, and while it also lacks many significant landmarks, its world is a little more occupied with, well, I wouldn't exactly call them friends. In a different game, maybe you'd have to watch out for sharks or school children biting you, but Subnautica is set on an alien planet, where sharks look like this, whales look like this, there's dragons here too for some reason, and all of them are very hostile. There's a bit more to explore and do in Subnautica when compared to Shadow of the Colossus, but with these deterrents keeping you in check at both shallow and deeper depths, you'll wish the world wasn't so big. Having such an open world turns a survival game where you're just trying to not die into a horror game where you're battling against the chance that there might be a leviathan just around the corner who can kill you very quickly. You've got all this world to explore and I kind of don't want to. Do you blame me? And with so many open worlds to explore from the 2010s onwards, it falls to me to pick out some of the best examples that I haven't yet covered. The Witcher 3 was probably the first open world game that I played where it felt like there were little to no sacrifices made in order to accommodate an open world setting. Too often a game ends up stretching itself too thin in order to make an open world work. Oh hey No Man's Sky, what are you doing here again? You can also have any of the more recent Far Cry games if you feel like I'm being too harsh on 2016 era No Man's Sky. But The Witcher 3 was so consistently good that I rarely, if ever, noticed the cracks that should naturally form when so much space needs filling with stuff. There's a lot to do in this game, and you're able to do it while travelling through a world that was so mesmerising that, until Red Dead Redemption 2 came along, was the most consistent open world I'd ever played. What we've seen more recently is a natural fatigue towards open world since they're so abundant at the moment, and that has led to a couple of games trying their hardest to stand out among a sea of mediocrity. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is perhaps the best example of an open world that feels the need to do more with its world than just fill it with stuff. Since this game was built from the ground up to allow you to interact with so many different objects and enemies in so many creative ways, helping an experimental player leave their own unique mark on their adventure with enough of a creative spark to their actions. Look out for the sequel whenever it comes out, because it'll be fascinating to see what has and hasn't been changed about Breath of the Wild's world in particular. Arguably, very little needs changing, but they've spent 5 years doing something, hopefully something worthwhile. And the last game that I want to talk about today is Elden Ring, which absolutely was in danger of being one of those games that is the result of being forcibly morphed into an open world environment. However, the transition is seamless, with Elden Ring retaining a lot of the environmental design of previous Dark Souls, except now it's all being linked together to be accessed at any time. This lends itself perfectly to Dark Souls' best and more well-known party piece, and I'm so happy that none of the brutal challenge has been lost by opening up the world a bit. There's a danger that open world games ease up on the difficulty so as to allow a player to not be barred access to a certain area by crazy strong enemies, but Elden Ring pulls absolutely no punches whatsoever. It's kind of like Subnautica, except instead of a big water snake being around the corner, it's one of these. thank you for that. Anyway, I suppose I need to wrap all this up now, don't I? Open world video games come in all shapes and sizes, but they can and often do provide different types of value to the player. The important thing to learn from open world design is that the base level of having an open world in the first place is generally enough to make a game a lot more interesting, with the potential for added challenge, greater immersion, a more involved sense of exploration, or even some good old-fashioned psychological damage. Point is that you need a reason and a purpose for why a game has an open world. Otherwise, you're making your game bigger just for the sake of it, and possibly marketing, and you'll just make one of those yearly Ubisoft games with towers that unlock a portion of your map. I don't need to tell you that we do not need any more of those, thank you very much.
I think that's my main takeaway from the research I've done in this video. Open world needs a direction. It's kind of ironic to say that, considering the amount of freedom those games give you. But if you're making a game big just for the sake of it, no one's going to care. What, you've made a 60-hour adventure where I just aimlessly wander around collecting, collectibles? That sounds fucking thrilling. This is RabbidLuigi, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure you like and subscribe for more in the future, and if you want to watch one right now, there's one here about ugly-ass video games. I also want to thank my top supporters on Patreon, including the Green Scorpion, Sarah Malion, and Devon Hutt. Thank you for watching, and games don't have to be really big.